Hi guys, it's Friday again. That means another video. Today I wanted to make a video regarding mitigating the effects of Regulation 28 on your retirement savings. Let me start by telling you a little bit about what Regulation 28 actually is and what it means for your portfolio. Well, Regulation 28 is essentially a part of the Pension Funds Act that governs all retirement savings in South Africa, and it means that there are certain limits to the assets that you can hold in your retirement savings. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail of what these limits are, but broadly speaking, it's 75% equities, it's 30% foreign investments, it's 25% property, there's no limit on cash, etc., etc. You can read up a bit more on what those actual limits are by just Googling Regulation 28. The point is, though, is that with these limitations, ultimately returns are also affected. The reason for this is because the driver of any portfolio's returns is ultimately always going to be the asset allocation. So what are the underlying assets? Different asset classes have different types of return patterns over time. And how much of each asset class are we holding? That ultimately will determine the outcome that we get in terms of the return over the long term in our investment. Now, for a lot of younger people, Regulation 28 is a problem because it limits specifically how much growth assets you can hold in your retirement savings. Before I go into too much detail, let me remind you, this is not advice. Advice would be specific to your situation, and this is just an illustration of the idea of how to get around some of these limitations. Okay, so let's have a look at it. So over here, I've got the example of an investor. He's got a 41% tax bracket. He's contributing 88,000 Rand this tax year to his retirement annuity. That essentially means he gets a rebate of 36,000 Rand. Now that 36,000 Rand, he then puts into a tax-free savings. At least that's the idea. Okay, so let's quickly look at what the asset allocation would look like in a typical balanced fund, which a lot of people are in with their retirement savings or in their retirement annuities. It would typically look something like this. So we can see there's local equity of about 42%. There's foreign equity of about 26%, so almost at that 30% level. Combined, we have an equity exposure over here of 68%, so just under that 75% limit. There's some bonds in here at 23%. There's a little bit of local property, a little bit of cash, and some other asset classes, okay, or some other assets. This is the spread on a typical balanced fund in South Africa, okay? So the problem here is for the younger investor, his returns will be somewhat limited by the fact that he can only have, well, in this portfolio, let's say about 70% growth assets. And we know that over time, the only way to get inflation-beating returns is to have a maximum amount of growth assets. So this will inhibit his returns over time. How do we mitigate this? Well, it's very simple. If this is the spread in your RA, what you do is you take your tax rebate and you invest it into a tax-free savings account. That tax-free savings account at this point in stage has no limitations in terms of what the assets could be invested in, right? So there's no Regulation 28 on tax-free savings. There's no limitations in terms of where those assets can actually be invested in. Now, for the purposes of this example, I've just said we go 100% into foreign equity with the tax-free savings account contribution. So 36,000 Rand comes back from the tax rebate and it goes into a fund that is 100% foreign equity. The reason for this is because we're trying to mitigate the effects of the limitation imposed by Regulation 28 on the investor's retirement annuity. Okay, so if we look holistically, actually now, if we consider that his tax-free savings account is also earmarked for retirement, if we look at his entire picture, what we've succeeded in doing is increasing his equity exposure and specifically his foreign equity exposure, which I believe in South Africa is an important consideration. So if we go and we look at the entire portfolio now, so retirement annuity and tax-free, his picture looks something like this. So instead of the just under 70% equity exposure we had, we now have closer to 80% equity exposure. We've also increased our foreign exposure by a factor of about 20% on the overall portfolio. And this will significantly influence the types of returns this investor will see in the long term. So it's a simple idea, but it could be very effective and it could really make a difference in the long-term returns that this investor could see. Hope that was helpful and some food for thought. If you have any ideas on videos that you'd like me to make, I'd love to hear from you. Take care. Ciao, ciao.